Hi there, 8th graders. This is History, Chapter 19, Section 2, Moving Closer to War, I believe is the title. Yep, Moving Closer to War. This is Part 2, starting on page 586 through 588. Do follow along. America realizes its peril. The fall of France and the threat to Britain shook many Americans out of their belief that events outside the Western Hemisphere were none of their business. The possibility that Hitler and Mussolini might add the British and French fleets to their own made the Atlantic Ocean suddenly seem narrower, and Congress began to heed Roosevelt's warnings. It appropriated billions of dollars for defense and passed a Selective Service Act in September of 1940, the first peacetime draft in American history, adding 800,000 men to the armed forces. Roosevelt's leadership endorsed. In the presidential election of 1840, the debate between internationalists, who wanted to get involved in the war, and isolationists, who wanted to remain neutral and stay out of the war, was carried on in both major parties. The Republicans nominated a newcomer to politics, Wendell Willkie, a Wall Street lawyer and utility company executive, best known for his criticism of the New Deal. For Democrats, the question was whether Roosevelt would seek a third term, breaking the precedent set by George Washington. With the United States facing war in Europe and Asia, Roosevelt felt his experience was needed. He kept silent until the Democratic Convention, then announced that he would accept the nomination. At first, both candidates agreed on foreign policy issues, but when Willkie slipped in the polls, he began to warn that Roosevelt's re-election would mean war. Roosevelt's promise to keep American troops out of war, Willkie said, was no better than his promise to balance the budget. In November of 1940, Roosevelt won re-election. With the world in crisis, most American voters did not want to gamble on a change in leadership. Aid to a desperate Britain. The British government was running out of money to pay for weapons, so the president proposed that the U.S. abandon its cash and carry policy. But not wanting to revive the old war debts controversy, Roosevelt suggested a lend-lease policy, wherein the United States would merely lend goods to Britain, which the British could return or replace after the war. Lend-lease again stirred debate, but public opinion was shifting in Roosevelt's favor. A poll in January of 1941 showed that 60% of Americans believed that it was more important to help Britain than to keep out of war. In March 1941, large majorities in both houses of Congress passed Lend-Lease, authorizing the president to send American supplies and weapons to other nations on any terms he thought would protect the security of the United States. Battle for the Atlantic. It was one thing to enact Lend-Lease, however, and yet another to get supplies across the Atlantic in time to help. When Hitler attacked Yugoslavia and Greece in the spring of 1941, the Nazis overran those countries before Lend-Lease aid could reach them. When Hitler's bombers failed to knock out Britain, he ordered his submarine fleet to starve that nation into submission. In trying to make sure that Lend-Lease supplies reached their destination, the U.S. was drawn step by step into the critical battle of the Atlantic. As German U-boats, and U-boats, that's another name for their submarines, as German U-boats sank British and American supply ships almost daily, Roosevelt ordered the United States Navy to protect merchant shipping. By the fall of 1941, American and German warships were exchanging fire, and in October, a German U-boat sank an American destroyer, killing more than 90 members of its crew. Congress responded by revising the Neutrality Acts to allow merchant ships to be armed. Germany turns on a former ally. Remember, an ally is a friend. While German-American tensions were escalating in the Atlantic, in June of 1941, Hitler, wanting Russia's vast wheat and oil supplies, suddenly attacked the Soviet Union. As German armies quickly advanced into the USSR, Stalin signed an alliance with Great Britain, and the United States offered Lend-Lease aid. American isolationists were outraged that Roosevelt would aid the Soviets, but Churchill knew that American aid to the Soviet Union would reduce German pressure on Britain. In supporting Roosevelt's decision, he remarked, "I have only one purpose, the destruction of Hitler. If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." By the end of November of 1941, very few Americans were preaching isolation. Most agreed with Roosevelt that the U.S. must be an arsenal of democracy to supply Great Britain and the Soviet Union against Hitler. In fact, about 15,000 Americans were already at war, most in British or Canadian uniforms. Aggression in the Pacific. While the Americans' public attention was fixed on the Atlantic and Europe, events were taking place in the Pacific and Asia that would eventually plunge the U.S. into war. Already in China, Japan moved against European colonies in Southeast Asia. This vast region contained the rice, rubber, tin, zinc, and oil needed for Japan's expanding industries. With France defeated, Britain on its knees, and the Soviets retreating in front of German armies, the U.S. was the only remaining obstacle to Japanese ambitions in the Pacific. Embargo. In September of 1940, Japan allied with the Axis powers, the countries of Germany and Italy. The U.S. quickly responded by cutting off exports of scrap metal to Japan. As Japan continued its aggression in Asia, President Roosevelt extended the embargo to include other products that had possible military uses. In July of 1941, he told the Japanese that the U.S. would help them find new raw materials if they abandoned their policy of conquest. When Japan rejected his proposal, the president halted all trade with Japan and ordered American forces in the Pacific to prepare for war. Appeal for peace. On October 18, 1941, the Japanese Prime Minister, Prince Fumimaro Konoye, resigned. Konoye had been willing to negotiate with the United States because he did not believe Japan could defeat America in a war. The new Prime Minister, General Hideki Tojo, did not share Konoye's views. He favored war to eliminate American and British influence in Asia. By late November, as the U.S. continued to insist that Japan honor the open door policy, Japanese leaders decided that if the dispute did not quickly come to a favorable conclusion, they would attack. Nonetheless, on November 20th, negotiations were opened in Washington, D.C. Representing the U.S. was Secretary of State Cordell Hull. Ambassador Admiral, I'm not sure how his name is pronounced, Nomura, and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu represented Japan. The talks stall. As negotiations deadlocked, Roosevelt realized that war was inevitable. On December 6th, the president appealed for peace directly to Japan's Emperor Hirohito. American officials did not know that on November 26th, a Japanese fleet had put to sea, headed for the United States' main naval base in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. To be continued.